our podcasts or whatever we're doing will it's an actual video, right?
Yeah, live
Hopefully,
stream on
hopefully it'll
YouTube.
be better audio this time. So, okay, great. Well, welcome all. We are going into some new territory tonight. Up until now, podcasts or whatever we're doing. I guess that works.
It worked.
Up until now, we've been doing narrative. We've been looking at stories, right? Where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a conflict that's resolved, and there's good guys and bad guys. It's easy to do stories because everyone likes being told a story, right? Our lives are stories. But tonight we get to go into a different type of literature, uh, literature that refers not to a story, but to embodied rituals. So actually, we know rituals are important for all cultures, all religions, and ritual is basically embodied communication, right? I mean, we do a little when we do body language when we communicate, but a ritual is a formalized, embodied action that communicates something. And this is where people stop reading the Bible because they want to read stories, right? So, what the part of the Bible we're looking at is actually instructions on how to do a ritual, which means that we have to approach it in an entirely different way. I mean, we've looked a little about this early on when we're looking at the Passover ritual and things like that, but this is the whole shebang now, and we're going to learn how to read it in a different way. We're even going to present it in a different way. I mean, there's some text, but really it's going to be like charts and stuff like that. I'm going to use a lot of different coloration of words so that you can see what's being communicated. Our basic question for a ritual is what does it do? And what worldview does it reveal? Okay, so at the center of this ritual world is what's in English called the tabernacle. You may have heard that term before. It's actually just a Latin term for tent. In Hebrew, the term is mishkan, which comes from the verb to dwell. So a mishkan is a place where someone dwells. It's a dwelling, right? So this dwelling, this tabernacle, it represents a monumental change in reality. Right? It's not just a tent; it represents a change in reality itself, and we will see how that's the case here. Okay, first of all, previously on the entire Bible, they were on the way, right? They're on the Israel is on its journey through the wilderness to its destiny, right? We saw there were various conflicts they had to overcome. There was a battle they had to fight to defend themselves, in which God wouldn't do it for them; they had to do it themselves. Moses got into a talk with his father-in-law and says, "You're not doing this right. You have to appoint a judiciary to run this people, to run this nation." So they appointed judiciary. There's Moses with his laws. And then finally, they get to the mountain that they're going to, right? Where God says, if you like, you can be my treasured possession among all peoples, though all the earth is mine. It's not obligatory, but if you'd like it, it's on offer, right? We talked about this third everlasting covenant in the Bible. Remember, the covenants are interventions into reality. They change the structure of the way things are. This is an entire voluntary thing. If you want to obey me, you can become my treasured possession. You can become a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And so then last time we talked about this covenant that is inaugurated at this mountain, and the people say, "Yeah, let's do it." And then we talked about the stipulations of this covenant. So this obedience part. Remember, obedience is never just there for its own sake. Obedience in this covenant has to do with becoming holy, becoming sanctified, entering the realm of the sacred. It involves some rituals, but we didn't really talk about those. It's mainly behavioral stuff. Moses reads it out to them. They say, "Yeah, let's do it." Um, so now God says, "Come up on the mountain. I'm going to give you some stone tablets and write stuff down for you." We're not told what's on these tablets, though. Everyone assumes it's the Ten Commandments, but it's not. Um, Moses goes up on the mountain and says, "I'm going to be gone for a while. I'll be back." Meanwhile, they decide to worship another god. They create a whole religion while he's away with this golden calf. God gets upset at it. He says, "Let me destroy them then. I'll start again with you." And then Moses says, "No, you can't. First of all, because you'll ruin your reputation if you do. No one will believe you anymore. Plus, you made a promise that you wouldn't. And so Moses convinces God not to destroy the people. But Moses gets into this whole thing about punishing them for committing this grave treason of worshiping another god. And he says, I will perhaps be able to make atonement for your sins. So there's this term atonement. We're going to hear all about that today. Atonement means removal. It means to remove or purify something. And this is the first occurrence of it in the Bible. Here, it's not a ritual. It's basically he's putting his life on the line. He says, please don't destroy the people. Uh, Kill me instead. That's his atonement, right? God says, no, I won't, but I'm not going to go with you anymore because I don't like you guys. You're treasonous. And then Moses gets, he says, please, I'm supposed to be your intimate friend. You favor me. He says, okay, I'll do it. So Moses is presented this amazing figure who can change God's mind in order to bring about this desired end. That's kind of where we left off last time. So we've looked at almost the entire book of Exodus. The only thing we haven't looked at is the second part of this thing about what happens at the mountain. What were those instructions that he was getting on those stone tablets? And then what happens after that? So
atonement means what?
Atonement means removal.
Okay.
It removes something from something else. We'll learn all about it tonight. So we learn that what they were talking about was not 10 commandments, but it was instructions about how to build a mishkan, how to build a dwelling place for the divine within the world itself. So we'll talk a bit more about the staggering, mind-bending nature of this, but this is the same source of all that exists, right? God is the source of everything that exists in creation. God can enter into creation, but not to stay. Right? God shows up, God's a voice, God's a burning fire, but he's not there permanently. Right? God wants him to build him a mishkan, a dwelling place in the heart of his own creation. So, you think of creator up here and creation down here. Well, that boundary is about to be blurred. Right? There's going to be a place within the world where the divine dwells in a special way. And the whole part that we didn't read last time, we didn't talk about, is the narrative of how to build this thing, and then the narrative of it's being built. Okay, so this is a summary of what we passed over last time. It begins with a description of this mishkan, this dwelling place. Then it pauses, and then there's a commissioning of the architect. This is another interesting piece. So if God can create everything, and God says, I want a dwelling place in the world, why doesn't he just snap his fingers and it appears? Could have done that, right? But instead, he gives instructions for human beings to construct a mishkan for him. There's the first blurring of the human and the divine in this story. So we hear about the architect, and then we hear the narrative of its construction, or the description of its construction. Okay, we begin with this scene. We've seen this scene before, but we have to remind ourselves of it. So here, the glory of God, the term glory, kavod, just means sort of the tangible presence. Remember, we talked about a theophany, which is like a manifestation of the divine. So this is what his manifestation looks like on top of a mountain. It's a cloud. This glory settles upon the mountain. It's a cloud, and it's seen as a consuming fire. Okay, so it's really powerful. Like I said, it's sort of like a nuclear reactor. But this isn't a dwelling place. This is just, hovering at the edge of creation. Okay, here's the part that we didn't do last time. It begins with a command. Yahweh says to Moses, speak to the Israelites, let them receive contributions for me. They are to make a sanctuary for me. Sanctuary means a sacred place, that I may dwell in their midst. They're going to build a place where I will dwell in their midst. And then I'll give you the details about how to do that. Notice that this is not, again, it's not even like he magically makes the materials appear for it. Every member of the community is going to contribute something to the construction of this. It is an expression of the community itself, so that he may dwell in their midst. Okay, so remember, in the past, God has never dwelt anywhere in the midst of humans before. Contrary to later tradition, God did not dwell in Eden. He just showed up occasionally. He did not even dwell at Bethel or Sinai. He's just visiting, right? So this is a totally new way of relating the divine to the human. Why is he doing this? Why does he decide to indwell his own creation? So here again is this, I want them to make me a dwelling place. There are two other passages where there's a kind of explanation of why or what the purpose is. The first one is from a part of the book of Exodus that we're reviewing today. He says, I'm going to dwell in their midst so that they shall know that I am Yahweh their God who did all this stuff for them so that I might dwell with them. So there's something about the dwelling with Israel, the dwelling with the community is an outcome of this whole bringing them out of Egypt. Wherever we see so that, that's a purpose clause. Why did he do that? So that, right? So here, the whole purpose is of the Exodus that we read about and we talked about the last 3 weeks was so that he might dwell with them. That's totally new. We've never heard that before. Same thing here. This is interesting too. He says, I'm going to set up my dwelling place in your midst and will not loathe you. Well, one would hope not, right? Ever present in your midst, I will be your God. You will be my people. I, Yahweh, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Why? To be their slaves no more, breaking the bars of your yoke and making you walk erect. So there's something here about, there's a relationship between this dwelling, the indwelling of the divine within the world, and human beings learning how to walk erect, not enslaved to other people or maybe even to other things, aspects of themselves, but learning how to walk upright. There's something about human development here. Somehow this dwelling place is not just for God's sake, but for human sake. Okay, commissioning the architect. He says, pick this guy because I have filled him with a divine spirit of skill and understanding. So God's not going to make it himself, but he's going to fill a human being with the skill to build this. Now, notice the other parallel here. Remember this one in episode 1? When God created the heavens and the earth, there was a divine spirit sweeping over the waters, and then God started creating stuff. What does that tell us about what's going on here? So in Genesis 1, God creates everything through a divine spirit, and now he gives that divine spirit to a human being to create something for him, to dwell within creation. Do you see this is about creation? Creation is not just about the past, it's not just about origins, it's about the divine indwelling the world. And human beings are involved in it, right? Divine help, obviously. So everything about this construction narrative will have parallels with the creation story. Okay, for example, when the tabernacle is complete, it says, thus the entire work of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting was completed. Moses saw that it was all done just as Yahweh had commanded, and Moses, blessed them. Well, look, when God finished creating, he looked at everything and found it good, and he blessed it because it was all complete. Notice it's exactly the same words. This is a creation story, right? But it's done by human beings. Divine and human agency is working together here. And according to that other passage, says that's the entire reason I did this, so that they could do this for me. Okay. Finally, the change of address. So this is the thing we started out with. We have the glory of God, the fire and all that hovering over the mountain. And then once the tent is finished, the glory does this kind of swan dive off the mountaintop into the tent. And notice it's exactly the same language. Just like the cloud covered the mountain, now the cloud's covering the tent. The glory of God settled upon the mountain, now it settles on the tent. The Israelites saw that. The Israelites see this. The only difference between the mountain and the tent is that the mountain doesn't move, right? The tent can move. So, because, where are they right now? They're not yet at their destination. They have to get to their land, right? So how is God going to be with them if he doesn't have a tent that can move with them, right? So literally, he's changing his address from this sort of this untouchable place beyond all human comprehension to the very center of human experience, right? The very center of this community. That's why it's so monumental in the story. Okay, we're now entering another book, the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is in the Latin named after the tribe of Levi, which is the tribe from which priests come. Remember, the Levites were the priests in the story of the golden calf. So this is where with one exception, narrative goes away and we get descriptions about rituals. So it has two main parts. The first part, which is what we're dealing with tonight, has to do with Israel in relationship to the tabernacle. If God is now your roommate, how is that going to change the way you live? If everyone's ever had a roommate, you know that it requires some adjustments, right? So imagine the source of all reality becoming your roommate. It's going to change things, right? So everything that we're looking at tonight is about what are the consequences of the divine dwelling within the heart of humanity, within the heart of creation. The second part, which is what we do next week, has to do with the community's relationship to the land it will dwell in once it gets there. If you will, this is looking outwards, right, from the community outwards into the larger society. The first part tonight is looking inwards, right, because this tent is going to be literally at the center of their community physically. Okay, this is what it looks like. Here's a reconstruction. So notice that all around it are sort of the encampments of the various subgroups within the people. So again, literally it's at the middle of the community. And it's surrounded by a bolt of cloth with movable pillars, essentially forming a courtyard with an entrance that you can get in. There we have the tent itself. And then in the yard, looks like there's a bird bath and a barbecue. That's what it looks like, right? It's not too far from the truth. So there are two things here. There is indeed a basin of water, and there is an altar. Right? An altar which will be central to this whole notion of atonement, and this is basically the means by which the divine can dwell amidst human beings. We'll learn about that now. Okay, here's what the tent looks like in relationship to everything. So here's the courtyard with the bird bath and the barbecue. This is the tent itself. It has two parts. It has sort of a outer part, which has some furniture in it. It has a lampstand, some incense, and an offering table, not unlike what we have in here, right? And then you have a curtain with an inner space. It's often called the Kadosh HaKodashah, which is the Holy of Holies, or the holiest place. And in the middle of this, there's something called the Ark, which is a box. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones, you know what it looks like, right? Golden with things. Okay, but what is this thing? They don't explain that in Indiana Jones. The Ark is a footstool. It's a footstool. It's a footstool for a throne. So kings sit on thrones, right? Remember, God was the mountain was the base of God's throne in the song the Hebrews sang. Now this is his throne, and it moves around with him. It's a mobile throne, if you will. This is his hotel room, right? Because you go to a hotel when you're traveling, and he's got sort of a place for food and water here. He's got incense to keep it smell nice, and he's got light. But you have in the middle of it, you have this footstool. So literally, this is sort of the spot where the divine and the created reality touch. Right? It's where it touches. So that's what it looks like. Okay, this is what we're looking at tonight. We have four parts. First one has to do with sacrifices. Now, of course, people have sacrificed things before in the stories, right? We've seen. Sacrifice appears to be sort of a spontaneous act in the Bible, right? Some of the earliest humans sacrificed without any guidance. Now there's going to be some guidance because these sacrifices, these offerings, these gifts will be in relationship to their new roommate. Then there's going to be an ordination, a sort of a ritual that operationalizes the priests who will run this thing. And then there are laws about what to do and what not to do in order to prevent the divine radiation from this tent to become destructive. And finally, there is a ritual for what happens when that doesn't work. How do we repair the thing? This is a nuclear reactor, right? Nuclear reactors can be very powerful and very good, right? unless it's Fukushima or Chernobyl, or if some of you remember 3 Mile Island, right? So if you get those places, what went wrong? What went wrong in those places, right?
Too much energy,
Too
not
much
shielding.
shielding. That's exactly right. So in order for a nuclear reactor to be life-giving rather than life-destroying, you need shielding, right? So pretty much everything here is all about the shielding. If the shielding is in place, if the shielding of the reactor is well kept, it's great. If you allow the shielding to deteriorate, then the radiation starts to become problematic, right? So think of the rituals as the means by which we keep the nuclear reactor going. Again, why not just have God, magically make a little container for his glory that has no human involvement? Instead, he wants human involvement, right? So let's take a look at this. Okay, the distinctive idea of all these chapters is atonement. So we're going to try to figure out what atonement is. So this is a phrase that is often used with regard to sacrifices in this tabernacle. It says, "Thus the priest shall make atonement on the person's behalf," the person who is offering the gift, "for the wrong committed, so that the individual may be forgiven." Notice forgiveness is related to atonement, but forgiveness is not the same as atonement. Forgiveness is an outcome of atonement. But what is this all about? I mean, I mentioned it means removal, but what is being removed from what? So, first of all, we learn that atonement is made with blood. And this actually solves a mystery that we heard about several weeks ago in the book of Genesis, when we had covenant number 1, right, which is how to regulate and limit violence. There was actually 2 commands. One was don't kill people, and the other one was don't drink blood. But it didn't explain why you can't drink blood. Right? Here is that prohibition: don't eat blood. In the book of Leviticus, we find out why you're not supposed to eat blood, because that's not its purpose. It says the life of the flesh is in the blood. Literally, it says it is the blood. And I, Yahweh, have given it to you, Israel, to make atonement on the altar for yourselves, because it is the blood as life that makes atonement. So we learned that atonement is something that it's a process that enables human beings to exist in proximity to the divine. It is achieved by the material of blood, and it takes place on an altar. Okay, let's get more information here. An important clarification: atonement is not made by slaughtering or burning an animal. There is this idea that many religious people have that God is actually a terrorist who is bloodthirsty and loves killing. Killing does not do anything here. You need to kill the animal to get the blood, but the killing is not what makes atonement. There's nothing to do with that. It has to do with the application of the animal's blood to the altar. It's not the killing, it's not the burning of the animal's remains, it's the manipulation of the blood on the altar. Here again is the language that we have. It's kind of lost in translation because the Old English word atonement means reconciliation, which is kind of the outcome of this process, but it is not what it means. So we say that atonement means literally removal or to remove. We need to ask, what is being removed from what? And how is it being removed? Well, we know that blood is involved somehow. Blood's not being removed. Blood is being applied to something. You put blood on the surface of the altar. Whatever the blood touches, that's where the removal is being taken place. So we have to ask, what is on the altar that needs to be removed? We'll find out. Okay, here's my example. Let's say I rear end your car. I've damaged your car, right? It's not like I said bad words about it. I actually objectively damaged it. So if that happened out in the parking lot here, what would be the normal process that we're all trained to do? We exchange insurance cards, and if I'm at fault, I have to pay to get your car repaired, right? Now, there's a difference between repairing the car and forgiving me. Let's say it was not intentional. Okay, well, you forgive me for it, but I still have to repair the car, right? Otherwise, the forgiveness really wouldn't mean anything. It would just mean that you don't really care about your car, right? So atonement is not forgiveness. Atonement is repairing the objective damage that is done. Now, so far, we haven't done anything here about blood or stuff, but we understand this because we probably encountered this before in our lives. We understand the difference between forgiveness and actually repairing the damage. Okay, so here is the altar upon which blood must be applied if something happens that jeopardizes the presence of the divine in the center of the community. Again, think of this as a nuclear reactor. If you do something that damages that relationship, that proximity of the divine to the human, you are compromising the shield, right? Ironically, the way you repair the shield is by putting blood on the altar. That still doesn't quite answer what's going on here, but essentially what it means is when you do something damaging, let's say the cars hit each other out here. So yeah, I have to pay to repair your car out here. And yet, at the same time, that action, whether it was inadvertent or not, actually damages this from a distance. This is something we find difficult to understand. However, in the ancient Near East, what the Bible calls defilement or impurity is seen as an aerial virus, which we actually do understand because we had to deal with it in our recent memory, right? And we know what an aerial virus is. So in the Bible, when you do something damaging that damages someone else or perhaps the shielding, the aerial virus attaches to this, and that's what needs to be removed. You put the blood on it, it again, removal is maybe not the best term here because you don't take the blood off. It's not like Windex where you wipe it off. You leave the blood there. So I would like to use the term decontaminate. So when you do something damaging, you contaminate the altar, which jeopardizes the dwelling of the divine in the midst of the community. And so you have to clean it up. You have to remove or decontaminate it by putting blood on it. That's the whole concept behind this. Now, that seems weird. It doesn't match with our notion of cause and effect. But we have to remember something. When we were hearing about how this was built, what was it being compared to? What was the construction of the tabernacle being compared to with the words that we looked at?
Tent.
Well, I mean, the construction of the tent was being compared to the creation of the world, right? This is a model of the world. This is a ritual model of the cosmos that was created in Genesis 1 with the important difference, the divine dwells within it now. So let's think about this. If we damage some part of the world, either another human being or a relationship or a community or the environment around us, will that have negative consequences? Will that negatively affect the world? Yeah. We know that. We see it happening all around. It's when and even if it's something like, it's one thing to, physically harm someone, but physical harm is not the only harm, is it? People can harm others with words. They can harm them by putting them in a situation that is not conducive to human well-being, right? We call that the environment, like the atmosphere, the psychological atmosphere of a place. So we actually do believe, we do understand that harm can be done without physical contact. So when we say, if enough people do bad things, it affects the environment around them. It affects the social sort of atmosphere, right? Well, if we acknowledge that to be true, then that's essentially what's going on here. When something bad happens, no matter where it is, this is what is affected because this is the model of the environment. This is the model of the world. So if we make that connection, all of these rituals will make sense. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so yeah, the blood is essentially sanitizer. That's why you apply it to decontaminate a surface. Okay, let's talk about sacrifices. There are 5 different kinds of sacrifices. They are all different. They do different things. We're going to learn what each of these does. There's burnt offerings, grain offerings, communion sacrifices, purification offerings, and reparation offerings. These are modern translations. We'll talk about what they mean. So this is, now, not all of these have to do with atonement. Some of them, like this, is you're doing something to celebrate, to have a party. So not all sacrifices are like repairing something that's wrong. Sometimes you're celebrating something. Sometimes you can do things just as a way of recognizing gratefully the presence of the divine in the world. But these two especially are about what we just talked about, reparation and purification. The fact that there are two different types of rituals for attending damage that is done to the atmosphere around you suggests that there are different ways of damaging things, right? Let's, though, take a look at the first one. Okay, so like I said, we're going to have to look at this as a pattern rather than a narrative. So it says, when anyone brings an offering of livestock as a burnt offering, what do? So animals are offered as offerings. You can either take it from the herd or the flock. Okay, so you can make an offering with one or two different types of animals. So there are two different types of protocols, two different types of ways of doing that here. And then it says, but if you offer a bird, then you can do this. Well, that's odd. Didn't it just say it's either from the herd or the flock? It sounds like you can only do those two things. But immediately it says, but if you do it with a bird, here's how to do it. This is the other thing about ritual. It involves formulas, but it also involves flexibility. Right? There are ways of doing something, but there are alternative ways, and that's why the instructions are complicated. What happens if you do this way or that way? Okay, talk about the color coding here. Almost all of these rituals involve priests. What are priests? Priests are basically technicians who wear hazmat suits, and therefore they understand how to approach the radiating surfaces, right, of the nuclear reactor. They are able to engage with the altar. So everything in blue, these blue shaded things, those are things that priests do. Everything in green is who the person bringing the offering is doing. Notice in every one of these blue cells, there's stuff in red. And what is in red here? On the altar, against the side of the altar, on the altar, on the altar. Whenever priests are mentioned, the altar is mentioned. Non-priests never touch an altar. Only priests touch the altar here. Because what do you have to apply to the altar? Blood. So priests are specialists in manipulating blood as a decontaminant. Okay, so you have these three different descriptions of what is done and what you do with the animal. Okay. What is a burnt offering for? Well, this is a bit complicated because burnt offerings have been used for a lot of things. Right? The first offering in the narrative was that of a burnt offering. So, for example, Noah makes a burnt offering. Why? We're not told. Abraham makes a burnt offering, or almost makes a burnt offering of his son. What was that for? Nothing to do with atonement. Why did God tell Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering? What was the rationale given in the story? Do you remember that?
Testing his faith.
His fear, but testing, yeah. This was a test of his fear of God, right? Had nothing to do with atonement, had nothing to do with forgiveness, had nothing to do, because he wasn't being, he didn't do anything wrong, right? So often offerings have different purposes. Moses' father-in-law makes burnt offerings when he visits him to celebrate. And then there is a regular daily burnt offering in the ritual of this tent. So if it's regular, then it's not responding to some unforeseen circumstance. It's not responding to some failure of something. It's just part of the ordinary way that you interact with the divine in your midst. Okay, so burnt offerings can be for anything. They have nothing to do specifically with the tabernacle. They've been in existence throughout human history, according to this. Okay, what about grain offerings? Well, guess what they involve? Grain, right? Grain. Okay, here's grain offerings. Okay, there's 4 columns here. So anyone who wants to bring a grain offering, it must consist of bran flour. Okay, so, and that talks about how you can shape this flour. Sometimes you can bake it or fry it or prepare it on a pan. You can pan it. So there's different like recipes for how to make a grain offering. That's why there's so many parallels here. Notice that priests still have to be involved with it because it involves the altar. When we look at when grain offerings are used, they're also just ordinary offerings. They're made on a regular basis. Because where does the grain come from? It comes from the earth. Where does the earth come from? It comes from God. So by making an offering of grain, you're saying, thank you. I live in a good universe that is able to supply my needs, and I'm saying thank you to its source. And that's what Thanksgivings are about. So grain offerings are about thanking. Notice there's no atonement because there's no blood. Okay. There's a couple of examples of that. Okay, communion sacrifices, having a celebration. So here, if a person brings a communion sacrifice, it has to be from the herd or from the flock. And then it talks about how you bring this there. The priest has to take the blood from it and put it on the sides of the altar. And then, unlike a burnt offering where the animal is incinerated in order to give it all to the divine, guess what you do with a communion sacrifice? You have a feast, you eat it. So you don't get rid of it. You share some of the animal, some of the victim, with the priests, and God gets some too. Why does God need any? Well, we're told he wants some food. Now, of course, God doesn't eat, right, in the same way that humans would eat. But if you're having a feast, you want to offer the food to everyone at the feast. So if God's being offered food at the feast, that means who's at the feast? He's sharing in the feast. That's why it's called communion, union with different people having something together, right? It's a celebration. What are the occasions for it? Well, it might be because you're being thankful for something, or you're fulfilling a vow, or it could be for any reason. It could be totally voluntary. There are rules for consuming it that have to do with when you do it, what state you're in, and then that you can't actually eat the fat or the blood because you're not supposed to eat blood. You're also not supposed to eat fat. That's for God. God loves fat. Priests get the brisket from the right leg. Okay. So, but again, this has nothing to do with atonement. It's all about celebrating, your daughter's wedding or your son's graduation, or we had a good crop this year. So far, all of these sacrifices are for ordinary, everyday things, right? There's nothing pointing to anything wrong. Once we get to purification offerings, now we're talking about atonement. So we need to figure out what are these things for. Now, literally, sometimes in English it'll say these are sin offerings. And indeed, the name of this offering sounds a lot like the word for sin. The word for sin is hata, and the word for this offering is hatat. Sounds very similar. The reason why it's not translated that way is because when we hear the word sin, we probably think of like you did something bad. You really messed up. We think of intentional badness when we think of sin, right? But there's nothing intentional about what this thing addresses. It's meant to cleanse the altar by decontaminating it from something else. Let's find out what it's for. Okay. Oh, wow. Look at this. When a person inadvertently does wrong by violating any one of the prohibitions of this covenant, what does inadvertently mean? If you
Not on purpose.
by accident, like if I rear end your car by accident, that's different from if I'm trying to run you off the road, right? So notice that the first reparative offering is not about intending to harm someone, it's by accident, right? Now, why are there so many columns here? It doesn't have to do with the severity of the accident. It has to do with who did it, who was responsible. So let's look at the different columns. Let's actually start here. If any one of the general populace does anything accidentally wrong, violating a prohibition and is thus guilty, upon learning of the wrong committed, because I might not notice it at first, that person shall bring an unblemished female goat and offer it. Okay, but what if the person doing the wrong is a leader? They have to bring a different kind of animal, a male goat. Well, what would be the difference between a leader making a mistake and an ordinary citizen making a mistake?
Leader might have more resources.
Okay,
Might have a bigger flock.
possibly.
More responsibility.
Maybe more responsibility. If a leader makes a mistake, maybe the impact could be greater, at least psychologically. than if I made a mistake.
Yeah.
So notice that the different gradations are not how bad it is, but who does it, because it could have a greater impact if a leader is doing something wrong. What's the next one? If the entire community errs inadvertently, without even being aware of it, when they do find out about it, they have to make a special offering, a bull. A bull is a little more expensive than a goat. And finally, if a priest makes a mistake, he has to offer a bull as well. Okay, so we normally think of, when we think of people being at fault for something, because we believe in individual free will and responsibility, we tend to limit wrongdoing to, even if it's accidental, to individuals, right? We wouldn't hold whole communities liable for something legally, right? We would normally say individuals are liable, right? Is that always the case, though? Is it possible that some wrongs or some damage can be done by an entire community? Not necessarily because they're all actively doing something, maybe because they're failing to do something. And if a whole community fails to do what is right, think of the impact. So before we even get into the details here, notice that it recognizes the possibility that some damage cannot be limited to an individual, that some damage could be the result of an entire system, not just of people, but of institutions and things like that. It recognizes that there is a possibility for collective responsibility. We hear about this a lot today, right? Individually, I don't pollute the environment, but I'm part of a society that pollutes the environment. I could say, well, I'm not doing it, so I'm not my fault. It says, no, you're part of a community that is doing something or not doing something that's having adverse effects. You need to take collective responsibility for it with and you know that because there's a special form of the offering to validate that collective responsibility. What about the priest? Well, if a priest does something wrong, notice that there's only priests involved at this point, all in blue, right? There's another difference here, though. It's not just what you offer. It's what has to be cleansed, what has to be decontaminated. So since it's too small to read, let's take a look at it. Okay, so if a tribal leader or anyone from the general populace, if an individual inadvertently violates a prohibition, this is what needs to be decontaminated, the altar. Okay? But what happens if the entire community or a priest violates something? Well, this also has to be decontaminated. Well, what else? Look at what happens. So it's not just, okay, there's more of you, so we need a bigger animal. No. A collective fault contaminates not just the outside, it even threatens the very presence of the divine in the world. A collective damage that is done threatens the presence of the divine in the world in a way that an individual can never do. And therefore, you get blood sprinkled over there as well. Same thing for a priest. Now, why would a priest individually contaminate this area? Because this is where the priests go. Everyone else doesn't go in there. They stay out here. So when we start to understand the spatial dimension of this, and when we understand this to be a model of the world, with this as the heart of the world that needs to be preserved, we see how there is an awareness that there are different gradations of damage that can be done, and therefore there need to be different remedies. That's the purification offering. So it's purifying or decontaminating the altar or even the tent itself. There are many special cases, various scenarios that are offered. Notice what is the one thing that is common to them all? What if you do something you're not aware of? Well, when you subsequently become aware of it, you need to take action. And the protocol for taking action once you are aware of it, even if it was like 10 years ago, is you have to act fast. Once you recognize that your actions or inactions have caused damage to the world or the community or whatever, you cannot let it lie. You have to take immediate action, right? So there's a sense of urgency here too. Responsibility is not just how do I distinguish my individual actions or inactions from those of the community I'm a part of, but what happens when we realize that asbestos really isn't good for us? You know, for how many years did people use asbestos and then suddenly realize it's not good? So you urgently have to then remove all the asbestos, right? From all those years that it's been affecting people. This consciousness is present in these rituals. Okay, and then there's this special thing that takes place there. Okay, the last kind of offering, what's called a reparation offering. Now, in a sense, all of this is about reparation. Reparation means to repair, right? In Hebrew, it's an asham, which literally means a guilt offering. But it's not guilt as in I feel bad. It's guilt as in I recognize that I've damaged something a bit more than something else. Let's take a look at how it defines it, because this has to be different. Okay, there's three scenarios. The first and the last say when a person commits sacrilege by accidentally misusing one of Yahweh's sacred objects. Let's say I stumble, I'm cleaning the tabernacle and I knocked the menorah over. Right? I inadvertently damaged one of God's own, hotel room furnishings. That's sacrilege. Sacrilege means violating the sacred somehow. Notice the other one though. When someone does wrong and commits sacrilege against Yahweh by deceiving another person about a deposit or a pledge or a stolen article, or by otherwise retaining a neighbor's goods unjustly, or if, having found a lost article, I lie about it, saying, no, it's not yours, it's mine, this is a totally different thing. So we understand this idea, okay, if the tabernacle is sacred space and I damage it, okay, that's sacrilege. I have to somehow make that up. But here it's equating that violation of the sacred with harming another person, and more specifically with harming their property. Right? If I take your stuff and say I didn't, I've committed sacrilege against Yahweh by doing that to you. Notice there's this kind of a blending together of the human and the divine here. So that maybe that's a consequence of the divine dwelling in your midst, is that when you harm other people, you're attacking the divine. Right? You're harming the fabric of the community that you live within. So what's the difference between a purification offering and a reparation offering? Property damage. So notice that in these offerings, you still have to make atonement. Notice you have to put stuff on the altar, but there's something else. So if I damage the menorah, I have to bring as reparation a ram, and it has to be equal to the amount of monetary damage I've done. I have to also restore what has been misused of the sacred object. I have to see that the menorah is repaired and add a fifth of its value. So I have to give interest to the person whose property I've damaged. So if I do that to the tabernacle, I have to give it to the priest. If I do it to my neighbor, what do I have to do? When I've done this wrong and am guilty, that person shall restore the thing that was stolen, or the item unjustly retained, or the item left as deposit, or the lost article that was found, or whatever else the individual swore falsely about. That person shall make full restitution of the thing itself and add a fifth of the value to it to the owner. So notice you can't even make this offering until you've repaired the damage financially with interest. Notice it's the same. It's pretty amazing. It's making harming another person's property equivalent to violating a sacred space. It's the same animal that needs to be given. And then there's the same outcome. So there is this. The ritual is not magic. The ritual signifies that the reparation has actually taken place. What about this middle one, though? What if someone does wrong and violates one of the prohibitions without realizing it? That's not necessarily accidental. It just says without realizing it. It's not quite the same as the previous one, because notice it doesn't say, like back here, when I become aware of it. Notice in this case, it doesn't even say the person becomes aware of it. But if a person objectively has done something, there needs to be a reparation. Now, how would I know that? Well, I might not know it, but I might be cautious. I might decide to bring a reparation offering every once in a while in case I've unknowingly caused some damage. We don't really do that often, but there's probably times, even on an interpersonal level, where we will make sure, give a little extra money to make sure we didn't shortchange the person. We don't know whether we may never know whether we violated them, but we're just going to make sure. So it's a cautionary principle, right? There's a big difference here, though, too, because this is accidental. This is not accidental, right? This is the only non-accidental action that can be resolved by a ritual. And even that can't happen until the actual damage has been repaired with interest. So this is a pretty important point, because this is the conclusion of the whole sort of suite of sacrifices and what they do. Notice, with this exception, there is no way of dealing with a deliberate wrongdoing. Yeah, maybe against a neighbor about property, but what happens if I punch you? What happens if I burn your house down? Well, I guess that'd be property. Well, what if you were in it? The offerings can do nothing with that. There's nothing in this system that accounts for what we might think of as the most obvious form of sin. The offerings do not attend to that, and that's going to be a problem, because in the one narrative in this book, which has to do with the establishment of priests, they're going to mess up. It's going to be another crisis stress test like the golden calf. They make the covenant and immediately they violate it. Same thing. The priests are going to immediately violate their hazmat rules, and they're going to be torched. And because they did not inadvertently, but on purpose, the question is, what do we do now? We have no ritual for dealing with this. They're going to have to create a new ritual. Okay. Notice also that all of these rituals have to do with a sense of human responsibility. They're all about responsibility, whether it's responsibility for acknowledging gratitude for the world we have, whether it's acknowledging responsibility for harming a person or harming property inadvertently. Everything is about responsibility here. And to take responsibility means to make atonement. Right? The example I always like to use with my students is, what if during COVID I sneeze on your desks before you get into the room, and I'm active with COVID? I said, "Excuse me, but I've sneezed on your desks, and you may be infected. Will you forgive me?" Well, maybe, but that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is the desks are contaminated. Unless I spray them and clean them, I have not atoned. That's what atonement is. Again, the environmental analogy is a nice one. We can be terribly sorry about the state of ecology, but the sorriness won't actually change anything. It doesn't actually clean anything up. So the point is simply that there is indeed a subjective dimension to wrongdoing, but there's also an objective question, right? And that's what this is all about. Okay, so we have the system in place, then we have a ceremony by which priests are prepared for this duty. There's all sorts of instructions about how to do this. They get oil put on them, and there's oil put on the tabernacle itself, so they are consecrated in the same way as the tent. And then they get special hazmat suits. Then there is a special offering that we haven't heard about, an ordination offering. This is curious. So in order for them to become operationalized, they have to be ordained. And what is involved in this offering? Okay, well, there's a ram. They kill the ram. What do they do with the blood, though? The blood is put on them. What's happening to them? They are being decontaminated. They're being atoned, literally, right? That's why atonement is not helpful as a word, because we think, oh, they're making up for something they didn't. So they're being decontaminated, or they're being brought from the realm of the ordinary into the sacred. But it's not like they're going into a blood shower like Carrie or something like that. Blood is being put on their ear. What is it? Their right ear, their right thumb, and the big toe on their right foot. What could that be about? I mean, surely they use more than a thumb in their work. What do you think that might mean? The ear, the thumb, and the toe. What could that be about? It doesn't say. Let's think what it might mean. From head to toe, without actually doing the carry thing. What do we do with our ears? We hear, and we listen, and we obey, or not. So by putting, decontaminates their oral apparatus. Do they hear the instructions correctly? Will they obey? In the Bible, hearing and obeying is sort of the same verb. What about the finger? Well, presumably they have to manipulate blood and they have to engage with the altar. That takes hands, right? Okay, so hearing and doing with your hands. What about the feet? Why would they need something on their feet? They're not stamping on the altar or anything like that. What would you do with your feet? What am I doing with my feet? I'm walking. Where am I walking? Well, if I'm in the tabernacle, I'm going to be walking into that space that no one else gets to walk into because there's too much radiation. So notice the 3 points on which they are made priests. It draws attention to the importance that they follow the protocol, that they manipulate the blood properly, and that they are mindful that they are walking on sacred ground. You might say that all this ritual stuff, all this embodied movement is all about mindfulness. And we can be mindful just in our minds, right? And that's one of the things that meditation allows you to do, is to clear your mind and be present. But if you're an athlete or if you're in sort of anything where it involves movement, you have to be mindful in the action, right? So their whole point is they have to be mindful. Okay. And to announce that the ordination is successful, they get a nice firework display. Everyone is joyful because we've done the beta testing. It is now operational. Houston, we have liftoff. And immediately after that, 2 of Aaron's sons, these are 2 of his sons who are priests, it says they took their censers and putting incense in the fire that they had set in them, they offered before Yahweh unauthorized fire, such as he had not commanded. What does that mean? We don't know, but it was unauthorized. They did exactly what they were not supposed to do, and apparently they did it willfully. And as a result, they get zapped. We're told fire came out from Yahweh's presence to consume them, and they die. Okay, so this is, again, an object tale, is that, radiation is dangerous. You have to actually be protected, and you have to not mess with the things you're not supposed to mess with. Okay, then God speaks to Aaron, their father, who is, again, sort of the made priest guy. This is the first time God has spoken to Aaron. He's been around for several chapters, right? Aaron is the mouthpiece in the Exodus. Moses, but it's always Moses. God talks to Moses, Moses talks to Aaron, and Aaron talks to the Pharaoh. God has never spoken to him before until this crisis. And what does he tell him? You must be able to distinguish between what is sacred and what is profane, between what is clean and what is unclean, and you must teach everyone else about this. Well, distinguishing things, that's an activity that God has been involved in for a long time. Distinguishing categories. For example, creation. God distinguishes light from darkness as the basic act upon which all other creative acts are based. In the Exodus, he makes a distinction between my people and your people, Pharaoh. And now he commands a human being to make distinctions. Notice the trend is from God doing stuff to God teaching human beings how to do stuff, or human beings participating in this divine activity of evaluating, of distinguishing things from one another. Okay, so let's talk about these categories. There are 4. There are not 2 with 2 different ways of saying. These are different categories. To understand the whole system that we're talking about, we need to understand the difference between these things. Okay, profane. Unfortunately, it's not a great translation, because when we say that's profanity, what do we mean by profanity?
Swear.
Yeah, in a negative sense, using harsh language, using inappropriate language, maybe. That's not what profane means, though. Profane means ordinary. The entire cosmos is ordinary in Genesis 1, except for the 7th day. And what is the entire cosmos in Genesis 1? It is very good. Profane means very good, but ordinary. Sacred means different, like the 7th day, or the mountain, or now the tabernacle. Nothing is by nature sacred. Everything is ordinary unless it is made sacred, right? By the source of all things. So God has enabled them to make a sacred place where they can be a sacred people. So this has to do with these categories of things that only God can assign as creator. But what are these about? Clean and unclean? Well, again, we think hygiene here, right? We think dirt. As we'll see, these are not categories involving dirt. clean and unclean, or pure and impure, you can pick your English translation. They have to do with states of being, conditions that human beings experience in the ordinary course of life. That's why they're both green rather than red. There's nothing bad about uncleanness per se, right? But certain human states, certain bodily states, render people unclean and therefore incapable of maintaining that. Okay, we're going to learn about this now. So there's no such thing as unholiness. There's only holiness and the absence of holiness. There's only holy and ordinary, sacred and ordinary. The opposite of holy is good. Again, that's what I said with the creation story. Here's about what is unclean. So we're going to learn about ritual impurity. There are five, really six sources of ritual impurity, things that make it impossible for you to enter into the tabernacle, basically. And they involve certain animals, childbirth, pathological infections on your body, sperm and menstrual blood, and corpses. Those are the sources of impurity or uncleanness. Notice there's no ethical valence to being born. There's nothing unethical about expelling sperm or menstrual blood. It just happens, right? There's nothing unethical about being dead. None of these are ethical terms. Now, in some literature, later in the library that we call the Bible, there will be a metaphorical application of these terms to sort of as having sort of moral valence to them. It's like, that's dirty, that's perverse, or something like that. That's not what's being talked about here. Everyone has been born, which means that everyone has experienced impurity. And notice that these also have to do with things that have been said. First covenant in Genesis 9. Any living creature that moves about shall be yours to eat, says God. I give them all to you. So if God gave all animals to all people, there's nothing bad about animals, about eating them or touching them, right? If God said be fertile and multiply, well, then I guess childbirth is not, there's no conflict between uncleanness of childbirth and fulfilling that divine imperative, right? For infections, if you get sick or you get sort of an infection on your skin, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just happens, right? Again, procreative fluids, that's how you might define this. They are also essential to being fruitful and multiplying, right? So there's nothing bad about that. Finally, corpses. There's a story in one of the books of the Bible later where there's a Jew named Tobit who's getting ready to celebrate a sacred feast, and his son runs into the room and says, "Father, someone outside has been murdered. There's a corpse outside." What is his response? His response is saying, "Let's wait until after the festival so we don't defile ourselves." No, he runs out. He springs to his feet, leaves the dinner untouched, carries the dead man from the square, puts him in one of the rooms until sundown so he might bury him, and then he washes, he cleans himself, and then he concludes the sacred feast. There's no avoidance of defilement, of uncleanness as an ethical imperative because you're celebrating a sacred feast. They're just two different things. Okay, so again, the language is difficult to us because we think of unclean as bad, but it is not seen as this here. But why are these things making people unclean and unable to enter into the presence of the sacred? All of these are also, except for this one, they're all temporary. So you're only born once, right? And your impurity only lasts for a certain number of days and then you're good. If you have sex, exchange procreative fluids, you're unclean till evening. That's it. It's temporary. Now, if you touch a corpse, then you have a period which you are unclean, but it doesn't last, provided you do the protocol. So all of these are temporary for the people experiencing them. It's not a categorization of people. It's just something that happens to everyone. Birth, consuming animals, sickness, reproduction, death. It covers the whole human life cycle. In other words, there are aspects to human existence that are unclean, not as a bad thing, but something that is apparently incompatible with the divine. As I like to say, God doesn't have sex. And so sexual reproduction and all the things associated with it are undivine here. It doesn't mean they're bad. They've been commanded of human beings. It just means that during the period of the effects of this, you're supposed to be mindful of the fact that you're not God. And you just don't approach the sacred space until the period has been completed. Again, like all the ritual, it's about mindfulness. And it's a mindfulness that reminds you about that you actually have a roommate who is totally unlike you, whose very presence is a power within the community that draws attention to your not being God. Right? That's the proper framework for thinking about this. So let's take a look at some of these things. So he says the real danger here is that if you experience uncleanness and you don't do anything about it, then you're defiling my tabernacle. So apparently, like these other inadvertent things, if you incur some sort of impurity and you ignore it and you walk into sacred space, then the altar is damaged and has to be repaired. Right? That's the problem. Okay, so now we're going to look at these laws, these instructions about this. Now, the first one has to do with animals. And even if you know nothing about the Bible, you probably know something about Jewish dietary laws, right? Kosher food. So this is where the kosher food idea comes from. Okay, so there's a list of animals that Israelites can eat and animals they can't eat. It doesn't apply to any other human beings because Genesis 9, all the animals I've given you, no problem. But for Israelites, part of this covenant, to enter into the realm of the sacred, you have to abstain from certain animals. And there are various categories that are given here. You can eat cloven-hoofed ruminants like cows and sheep and goats. You can eat water animals that have fins and scales, which is most fish. You can eat some birds and insects that have legs jointed above their feet and that leap from the ground, but you cannot eat animals that swarm on the ground. No rats in swarms, no lizards in swarms, nothing. What is the criteria involved in this? Notice that almost all of these things that categorize an animal as clean have to do with locomotion, how they move. Cloven-hoofed animals. So anything that's not cloven-hoofed, can't eat it. Finned and scaled animals in the waters. Okay, that has to do with how they move. They need fins to move, right? How do insects and birds move? Everything has to do with locomotion. Well, why would that be? Well, remember creation story number 1, right? The very good world that was created. There were 3 zones to it, right? There was the sky, there was the land, and there was the sea. And in the first creation story, God places certain kinds of animals in each of those places. He puts winged animals in the sky, like birds. He puts various animals on the land, and he puts sea animals in the sea. In other words, all animals are good, but some animals conform by their mode of locomotion to the ideal form of the cosmos, whereas others deviate from that in some way. That's what makes an animal clean or unclean. Now, there are a couple of, there's one exception to this. Can you think of a cloven-hoofed animal that is not a ruminant, that doesn't chew, grass basically exclusively, that people often eat?
Pigs.
Pigs. Pigs are the only cloven-hoofed animal that is not a ruminant. And it raises a question, why then do you add this thing about diet? Rumination is a form of diet, not of locomotion. Well, let's think back. What was covenant number 1? Don't kill people, and if you eat animals, drain them of blood. Okay, well, are there animals that eat other animals that don't drain them of blood? Of course, animals can't drain other animals of blood, right? You're a predator, you take an animal down, you eat it as is, right? Raptors, predators, there are plenty of animals whose mode of diet violates covenant number 1. They consume blood. And when you look at if you were to look at the list of all prohibited birds, they're all carnivores. Now, what about the pig? Well, pigs can eat plants, but they're omnivorous. They can also eat people if put in the right position. So in other words, there's the 2 criteria seem to be, as a people whose embodied existence is to somehow mirror and align with the sacred. First of all, minimally, they have to align with the categories of creation, sky, water, land, and they also have to not eat blood, and therefore don't eat animals that eat other animals. That seems to be what's at stake here. So here, it has something to do with conforming to the ideal universe, as is described in Genesis 1. Okay, talking about the diet thing. Okay, what about childbirth? What happens with child? Well, actually, the child itself is not rendered unclean by being born. It's the mother who is unclean. Now, there are different things. If it's a male child or a female child, there's a different period of impurity. And notice that atonement has to be made. So that means that the woman is actually damaging the altar. She's not doing anything wrong, but the effect of having a child apparently is causing some damage, in an unavoidable damage. But what is that damage? Why is it focusing on the mother rather than on the child? Very likely it involves blood, because there's blood that comes when a person is born, right? What is the purpose of blood? It is to make atonement on the altar, right? Well, you don't atone with lochial blood. So there's something about blood as a substance, particularly as it is involved in the transmission of life, that is somehow incompatible with the God who does not have sex. It marks you as human rather than divine. We'll see that later. Surface infections. Here's a fun one. I call these surface infections. You've probably heard of it as leprosy, but in fact, it has nothing to do with leprosy. So there's this concern about the surfaces of the human body getting these scaly infections, or infections of fabrics and leather, textiles, or even houses. Now here, the translation says fungal infections. That's not what the Hebrew says. It's all the same word, sara'at. Something about the irregularity that is created pathologically by certain conditions on the skin, on textiles, fabric, or on houses. What is this all about? First of all, it is not leprosy. How did it become leprosy in our popular imagination? So the Hebrew tzara'at, when the Bible was translated into Greek, the term is translated as the Greek lepra, which sounds kind of like leprosy, right? However, in ancient Greek, lepra does not mean leprosy. It means any number of skin ailments. In fact, the Greeks had a different word for leprosy. It was elephas. So if the translators of the Bible thought they were talking about leprosy, they would have said elephas instead of lepra. In the medieval period, there was an Arab physician, I don't remember what his name was, where he reused the word lepra to mean what we call Hansen's disease, which is leprosy. And as a consequence, we misidentify what the Bible is talking about. Leprosy is a contagious disease, right? It eats the skin away. It's incurable. Once you have it, you can't get rid of it, right? That is not what is being talked about here, though. Nothing of the sort. We know this, first of all, because not just because of the language that was used, but leprosy did not exist in the Middle East at the time the Torah was written. Alexander the Great brought it back when he did his conquest of the East. It was originally in Asia, and when the Greeks invaded Asia and came back, they brought leprosy with them. That was the 3rd century BC. This was written long before that. So whatever it might mean in the later texts, it does not mean leprosy. That has pretty profound consequences for our understanding of what's being talked about here. So let's actually look at what happens if you have one of these scaly infections. So your garments have to be torn apart. You have to dishevel your hair, and if you have a mustache, you have to cover it, and then you have to say unclean, unclean. As long as the infection is present, you will be unclean. Being unclean, the individual shall dwell apart, taking up residence outside the camp. Notice it's social distancing, right? You know what that's about. Okay, well, these particular actions, rending your garments, disheveling your hair, these are mourning practices. In the ancient Near East, people tear their hair out and tear the clothes when they're in mourning. So, in other words, this experience, this natural experience of pathological skin infection is something to mourn. And it requires a certain social distancing involved. But guess what? Of all the various forms of impurity, it's the only thing that is not contagious. So let's say you have sara'at, I have not become contaminated. You can touch a person who has sara'at and you are not contaminated. That's why we know it's not leprosy as well, right? Very interesting. Okay. There's a very elaborate way in which the person who has been afflicted is brought back into the community. It involves priests. There's priests up there, priests here, determining that, yes, the scaly infection's gone away. What do they have to do? Well, they have to engage in a purification ritual. It involves blood, and uniquely, it involves putting blood on their ear, their thumb, and their toes, just like a priest being consecrated for the tabernacle. So that analogy suggests that there's something about in this worldview, in this ritual world, there's something about the integrity of the human body that's really important. That if the human body is somehow disfigured temporarily by this ailment, it is not ideal. Right? Just like the animals that are categorized as unclean are not ideal for the sacred experience. That they brought in. Notice priests don't actually heal them. It's assumed that these illnesses will go away on their own, that they'll go into remission. There's another thing: houses can be infected too. You have to make atonement for a house too, because that causes infection too. Okay, so the second to the last form of ritual defilement, genital fluids, not like urine or anything like that, but rather procreative fluids. And we already heard the thing about childbirth. We'll find that sexual intercourse does the same thing. And it both for men and women, it's no different. Men and women are equally not divine, right? It talks about both regular emission of procreative fluids as well as irregular emission. All of these things render the person not able to enter into the tabernacle for that period. So apparently, sexual intercourse, the man makes the woman impure, and when a woman gives birth, she has local blood. When she has menstruation, she has a blood purity, what it's called. But there's something again about procreation that makes it incompatible with the sacred. Not bad, very good, in fact, but it requires this mindfulness of stepping back from the sacred. Okay, last thing: corpses, touching corpses. Now, if you remember, in this thing about what animals you can eat, there's also all this stuff about what happens if you touch the corpse of an animal, whether it's clean or unclean. If you touch a corpse of an animal, then you are temporarily unclean. You wash and you're good. With a person, though, if a person dies and you touch the corpse, then you have incurred impurity, and there's an elaborate ritual by which you are cleansed. It has to do with burning an animal and using its ashes with water to kind of somehow apply them on you, and then also to purify the altar. Let's see, where is I going here? Here's where I'm going. No, sorry. There's two examples of if someone dies in a tent, inside a building, and you're in the building, then you're affected by it. If someone dies in the open and you touch them, then you're affected by it. In both cases, it's not dangerous. You just purify yourself and that's it. But if you fail to purify yourself, then you're threatening the tabernacle. So this is it sounds like almost an obsession, but actually this is very benign compared to what you have in ritual purity systems in Babylonia, other parts of Mesopotamia. Impurity or uncleanness is not dangerous. It does not endanger human beings unless you don't do anything about it and you step into the tabernacle without your hazmat on, right? So again, it's all about the relationship between your neighbor living in your midst and you, right? Okay, so that's everything. So the question is, not all of these forms of impurity actually damage the tabernacle. They don't require atonement, but ones that do are, again, sexual discharges from men and women, contact with a human corpse, and these surface infections people get on their body. So again, if we try to identify what are the common denominators here, well, there's reproduction is one, and then also the integrity of the human body is another. We probably can't speculate more than that, but to think about if you live in a system like this, which is many people do, you're unclean most of the time. There's nothing wrong about it, but it makes you mindful that you are not the divine. You are but by engaging in these simple purification rituals, you are able to overcome these natural limitations, if you will, and enter into the space of the sacred. Okay, last thing. So we remember when the priests made their mistake, right? And there was no solution to this because there are no rituals to deal with direct intentional violation of the sacred. We need a new ritual. And that ritual is called the Day of Atonement. This is our last thing tonight. Yom Kippur, as it's called in Hebrew. Okay, so it begins with a conversation. God says to Moses, this shall be an everlasting statute amongst you. Once a year, Kippur, removal, decontamination shall be made on behalf of the Israelites for all their sins. Not just the inadvertent ones, the accidental ones, but for everything, including the intentional ones. Once a year, we're going to do a spring cleaning. This is actually not unique to the Bible's culture. In Japanese culture, you have a spring cleaning of the house, which involves a purification ritual. In many cultures, you have this, the idea of starting anew. So that's sort of what this is. Okay, so first of all, he says, don't let your brother, the priest, go into the sacred place at any time. Go there only on this one day. Okay, so the priest it says atonement is to be made by the priest who has been anointed and ordained. So that's Aaron. He has to put on his hazmat suit. Can't go in there without his protective shielding. And then you're going to have a special ritual. Notice what it involves. It involves 2 purification offerings, one for the priest, one for everyone else, and 2 burnt offerings, one for the priest, one for everyone else. Now, purification offerings, nothing new about that. It's part of the ordinary way of doing things because you need to, you need to cleanse what's been affected. But if you look in vain for any ritual involving 2 goats, this is a totally new ritual. 2 goats. One for the priests and one for the people. Okay, so this is going to involve slaughtering these animals and using their blood, manipulating their blood to cleanse what's been affected by everything, intentional as well as non-intentional faults. But before you do that, you have to take the 2 goats and you're going to draw lots. And one of the goats is going to be dedicated to Yahweh, and the other one will be dedicated to something called Azazel, which may be a person or a thing, some maybe demonic force perhaps. But here's the key. The goat determined for Yahweh will be offered as a purification offering. You're going to kill it, manipulate its blood, just like any purification offering. The other goat, the one for Azazel, will not be killed. And that goat is going to make atonement as well. You see the innovation here that up until now, atonement means manipulating the blood of a slaughtered animal on whatever has been affected by it. But now the idea of atonement has been extended to something more, something that does not involve blood. You're going to send this goat away from the community into the desert, where it will be sent to Azazel. Okay, so mysterious language. Let's see how this works. Okay, so first of all, notice what's being purified. So if you're going to purge everything, intentional as well as unintentional, notice what has to be cleansed. Not just the altar here, not just the furnishings, the throne. So notice what is that saying? So whatever the blood touches, it's what's affected. So unintentional accidents affect this. Unintentional accidents by the whole community affect this. What do intentional accidents affect? Not accidents, but intentional wrongdoings. It affects the very heart of the tabernacle. Intentional wrongdoing is more severe than accidents. Well, we would say, yeah. But notice here, it's kind of dangerous because if you let that go, either there'll be more incinerations or God's going to leave. And the whole point of this whole thing, to bring the divine into the world, will be eradicated. So again, just as human beings are involved in building this place and acting in this mindfulness according to it, they also are responsible for keeping the divine in the world itself. If they do not do this, it goes away or destroys them. Neither are good alternatives. So knowing that, God creates a ritual that allows them to overcome that problem. So it says they have to purge or decontaminate the entire sanctuary for all of the impurities and trespasses, including all their sins. So intentional as well as unintentional. Same thing for the bulls. Notice it goes from the inside out. from the most urgent thing that needs to be decontaminated to the whole thing, the whole tent. And then finally, the altar outside. Everything. Okay, what about the goat that isn't killed? He's going to take that goat. He's going to confess over it. He's going to name all of the iniquities, the intentional wrongs that have been done that year. And he's going to put it on the goat's head. Have you ever heard of the term scapegoat? Guess where it comes from? Another cultural reference, right? Okay, well, this is pretty amazing. So all the blood stuff, that does the ordinary activity of cleansing the building, right? But how do you remove the effects of an intentional wrong from the person who's done it? Anyone who's involved in reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, knows that it's very important for the offender to confess, to say what he or she did, especially to the victim, right? To acknowledge. So notice that this ritual begins not with killing the goat, but with acknowledging, naming all of the things that have been done that cannot be covered by those other ordinary rituals. Having done that, then sends it off into the wilderness to carry off all their iniquities to an isolated region where it will be not affect them anymore. Okay, and then, so all of this has been things that the priest has to do, but what are the people doing in the meantime? Well, because it's involving their things that they have done wrong, they have to be involved actively, and here's what they do. Sorry, we're going backwards now. Here we go. One of these ring compositions. An everlasting statute for you, repeated there. On the 10th day of the 7th month, every one of you, whether a native or a resident alien. So notice, it's not just a religious thing. It was for Israelites, it would be their religious thing, right? But this is for any human being who is physically present, socially connected with this community, because anyone in a community can do wrong, right? So everyone has to be involved. What do they have to do? You have to humble yourselves and do no work. You have to humble yourselves. Why? Because on this day, atonement is made for you to make you clean. There's that decontamination image of all your sins who be cleansed before Yahweh. Okay, so this is a different kind of cleansing, a different kind of decontamination that involves self-humbling, not putting blood on yourself, but humbling. Now, in the later traditions of Judaism and Christianity that emerge out of this, we call this spiritual poverty. It's a recognition that one did not create the universe, that one did not create the ethical laws that govern the universe, but one sees oneself as living within it and trying to live in accord with that harmonious world. That's what humbling oneself is. So notice that while the ritual stuff is doing there, you have to be psychologically humbling yourself. And hopefully you told the priest what he had to confess about you up there too. Maybe he doesn't name names, but we know, again, any truth and reconciliation process involves articulating with words, right? And presumably also some sort of action that shows a acknowledgement of what has been done and a desire to avoid it in the future. So this then becomes the ultimate ritual, one that incorporates what already exists and adds this other psychological or spiritual dimension to it. And this is what happens every year. In Jewish tradition, Yom Kippur is preceded by 10 days called the days of awe, meaning the days when you were to humble yourself. During those days, you have to think about every other person you've offended, and you have to go to them and you have to apologize, and maybe even try to make it up somehow. If you do not, then that fault cannot be forgiven in this collective ritual. You have to actually seek the forgiveness of the other person, and they have to do it for you. Because, as an early Jewish text says, for sins against God, like the tabernacle, the Day of Atonement brings atonement. But for sins against one's fellow man, the ritual of the Day of Atonement brings no atonement until he has become reconciled with the fellow he has wronged. So only human beings have the power to bring about this kind of atonement by their active engagement in reconciliation. And that's where we can maybe use the term atonement in that conventional sense. But this system involves both of these things. Okay, so we've now seen the entire first part of Leviticus. It all has to do with living with God as the roommate, has to do with the notion of the sacred, how you live with that, how you respond to it. And then the next time we're going to get into the whole thing about how do you live in society now, looking outwards. Any thoughts about this? I mean, probably you've heard things you haven't heard before. Um, many of us do not have rituals. I and a few others here are in a tradition that does have rituals, and we're very sort of conscious of the various meanings that it has. But every human culture has rituals that address these things, not just verbally, but with embodied action. But you can see, hopefully, beyond the weirdness of some of these things, they all have to do with some notion of human wholeness, and not just of the individual, but also of the community and how the community lives within that model of the cosmos. So if you think of the tabernacle as a cosmos, and if you live mindfully in relationship to that, do you think it might lead you to live mindfully outside of it as well? The tabernacle is practice for living in the world, which leads to the next part that we're going to look at next week. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.